Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stood at attention in the blazing desert sun, sweat trickling down her back beneath her military uniform. The training base in Arizona stretched endlessly around them, a harsh landscape that matched the brutal intensity of their daily drills. She had been serving for 3 years now, working her way up through the ranks with determination and skill that impressed everyone except one person. Captain James Morrison. Sarah wiped her brow as she waited for the morning briefing to begin. Around her, other soldiers chatted quietly, but she remained focused on the task ahead. Today was evaluation day, and she knew this was her chance to prove herself worthy of the promotion she had been working toward for months. "Listen up, soldiers." Captain Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. He was a tall, imposing man with cold gray eyes and a permanent scowl that seemed carved into his weathered face. At 45, he had spent over 20 years in the Army, and his reputation for being tough on subordinates was well known throughout the base. The group of 12 soldiers snapped to attention. Sarah held her breath, knowing that Morrison's eyes would inevitably find her in the lineup. For reasons she could never understand, the captain had singled her out from day one, treating her with a level of harshness that went beyond normal military discipline. Today's evaluation will test your combat readiness, tactical thinking, and ability to perform under pressure, Morrison announced, pacing back and forth in front of them. Those of you who fail will find yourselves cleaning latrines for the next month. Those who excel might actually prove they deserve to wear this uniform. His gaze stopped on Sarah, lingering with obvious displeasure. Some of you seem to think that just because you've managed to scrape by for a few years, you're ready for greater responsibilities. Let me be clear, competence is earned, not given. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she maintained her composure. She had learned early in her military career that showing emotion in front of Morrison only made things worse. The other soldiers avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the obvious tension between their lieutenant and the captain. The first test was a tactical obstacle course that required both physical strength and strategic thinking. Soldiers had to navigate through a series of challenges while making split-second decisions about the best route to take. Sarah had practiced this course countless times and knew she could complete it faster than most of her peers. As her turn approached, she felt her heart rate increase. This was her moment to shine, to show Morrison that his constant criticism was unfounded. She had trained for months, pushing herself harder than anyone else, staying late after regular hours to perfect her technique. "Martinez," Morrison called out. "You're up. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly." A few soldiers shifted uncomfortably at the captain's obvious hostility, but no one dared to speak up. Sarah stepped forward, positioning herself at the starting line of the obstacle course. She took a deep breath, focusing on the path ahead. The whistle blew, and Sarah took off like a shot. She vaulted over the first barrier with perfect form, rolled under the low crawl section without losing momentum, and scaled the rope wall with impressive speed. Her movements were fluid and confident, each step calculated and precise. Halfway through the course, she was ahead of the best time recorded that day. The other soldiers watched in admiration as she navigated through the tire run and approached the final section, a complex maze that required both speed and tactical thinking to complete successfully. Sarah paused for a split second at the entrance to the maze, quickly analyzing the 3 possible routes. She chose the middle path, knowing it was the most challenging but also the fastest if executed correctly. Her decision proved right, and she emerged from the maze with a time that beat the previous record by 15 seconds. The other soldiers burst into spontaneous applause. Even the usually stoic Sergeant Williams nodded in approval. Sarah felt a surge of pride and satisfaction as she caught her breath, certain that her performance had finally proven her worth to Captain Morrison. But when she looked toward the captain, his expression was darker than ever. "Adequate," Morrison said curtly, making a note on his clipboard. "Though I noticed several form violations that should have added penalty time. Martinez seems to think rules don't apply to her." Sarah's heart sank. She knew her form had been perfect. She had practiced every movement hundreds of times. The other soldiers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with Morrison's unfair assessment. "Sir, with respect, I believe my form was," Sarah began. "Are you questioning my evaluation, Lieutenant?" Morrison's voice was dangerously quiet. Sarah realized she was walking into a trap, but her frustration overwhelmed her caution. "No, sir. I'm simply requesting clarification on which specific form violations you observed." Morrison's eyes narrowed. The violation was your attitude, Martinez. Your arrogant assumption that a flashy performance makes up for a lack of true military bearing. Speed without discipline is worthless. The accusation was so unfair that Sarah felt her hands clench into fists at her sides. She had shown nothing but discipline and respect, even in the face of Morrison's constant hostility. But she knew that arguing further would only make things worse. The rest of the evaluations continued, but Sarah's mood was ruined. She completed each task with professional competence, but the joy of achievement had been stripped away by Morrison's harsh criticism. When the final scores were announced, she had earned the highest marks in every category except military bearing, where Morrison had given her a failing grade. After the other soldiers were dismissed, Morrison approached Sarah with a satisfied smirk. "Walk with me, Martinez. We need to have a conversation about your future in this army." They walked toward the edge of the training ground, away from the other soldiers. Sarah's stomach churned with anxiety, knowing that whatever Morrison had to say would not be good news. "You know, Martinez, I've been watching you for 3 years," Morrison said, his voice conversational, but with an underlying threat. "You think you're special, don't you? Think you deserve special treatment because you can run fast and follow orders?" "No, sir. I just want to serve my country to the best of my ability," Sarah replied carefully. Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your country doesn't need soldiers who think they're above their superiors. What it needs is people who understand their place in the chain of command." They stopped walking, and Morrison turned to face her directly. "I'm recommending that your promotion be denied. Furthermore, I'm placing a formal reprimand in your file for insubordination during today's evaluation." Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. A formal reprimand would follow her for the rest of her military career, making future promotions nearly impossible. "Sir, I don't understand. I followed every order and completed every task successfully. You question my authority in front of other soldiers," Morrison said coldly. "That's insubordination, plain and simple. Maybe a few months of cleaning duties will teach you some humility." The injustice of it all overwhelmed Sarah's self-control. "This isn't about insubordination, and you know it. You've had it out for me since the day I arrived here. Nothing I do is ever good enough because you've already decided I don't belong." Morrison's face flushed red with anger. "How dare you accuse me of bias? I treat every soldier under my command with the same standards." "That's not true, and everyone knows it," Sarah shot back, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "You've been looking for any excuse to destroy my career, and now you're manufacturing reasons because I won't quit like you want me to." The argument was getting louder, and Sarah realized that other soldiers had stopped what they were doing to watch. She knew she should stop, should apologize, and try to salvage the situation, but 3 years of unfair treatment had finally reached a breaking point. "You want to know what I really think, Martinez?" Morrison's voice was now loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think you're a liability. I think you're weak, undisciplined, and completely unsuited for military service. You've been coasting on the Army's misguided diversity policies, but real military leadership requires more than checking boxes." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. The racist and sexist implications were clear, and she felt her face burn with humiliation. Around them, at least 20 soldiers had gathered, watching the confrontation with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. "You have no right to speak to me that way," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger and hurt. "I have every right," Morrison replied, stepping closer. "I'm your superior officer, and if you don't like how I run things, you're welcome to request a transfer. Though I doubt any other unit would want a troublemaker like you." The public humiliation was complete. Sarah stood there in front of her peers, having been torn down and insulted by her commanding officer in the most personal and professional way possible. She could see the sympathy in some of the soldiers' eyes, but she also saw the discomfort and the desire to distance themselves from her now toxic situation. Morrison seemed to realize he had gone too far, but his pride prevented him from backing down. "This conversation is over, Martinez. Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow for your new assignment." Dismissed. He turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the center of the crowd. The other soldiers began to disperse, some offering her sympathetic looks, but none willing to openly support her. She understood their position. Speaking up against Morrison would only put their own careers at risk. Sarah remained frozen in place for several long moments, trying to process what had just happened. Her career was effectively over. Morrison's reprimand and transfer recommendation would follow her wherever she went, marking her as a problem soldier who couldn't be trusted with responsibility. The worst part wasn't even the professional consequences. It was the personal attack, the clear implication that she hadn't earned her position through merit but through some kind of special treatment. It undermined everything she had worked for, every sacrifice she had made to serve her country. As she finally began walking back toward the barracks, Sarah felt a deep sense of defeat settling over her. She had always believed that hard work and dedication would be enough, that if she just proved herself worthy, she would be accepted and respected. Morrison had shattered that belief, showing her that some people would never see her as anything more than an outsider who didn't belong. The evening passed in a blur of sympathetic glances and awkward conversations. Her closest friends on the base tried to offer comfort, but Sarah knew there was nothing they could do to change her situation. Morrison held all the power, and he had made his decision about her future. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow bunk staring at the ceiling, wondering if she should just resign and save herself further humiliation. Maybe Morrison was right. Maybe she didn't belong in the army after all. The thought was painful, but the alternative seemed to be years of continued harassment and blocked opportunities. She thought about her father, who had served in Vietnam, and inspired her to join the military. He had always taught her that the army was a place where merit mattered more than background, where hard work could overcome any obstacle. But her experience with Morrison had shown her that prejudice and personal animosity could still destroy careers, regardless of competence or dedication. As sleep finally began to claim her, Sarah made a tentative decision. She would give it one more day, report to Morrison's office as ordered, and see if there was any possibility of salvaging her situation. But if tomorrow brought more of the same treatment, she would seriously consider ending her military career. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring an unexpected visitor to their base, someone whose presence would change everything about her situation and her future in the army. The next morning arrived too soon for Sarah's liking. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the humiliating confrontation with Captain Morrison over and over again. Each time she remembered his words about diversity policies and her supposed weakness, her anger flared anew, followed quickly by the crushing weight of helplessness. At 0800 sharp, Sarah knocked on Morrison's office door, her uniform pressed to perfection despite her inner turmoil. She had decided to maintain her professional standards regardless of how she was treated. If this was going to be the end of her military career, she would at least go out with dignity. "Enter," came Morrison's gruff voice from inside. The office was sparse and functional, decorated only with Morrison's various commendations and a few photos of him with previous units. He sat behind his metal desk, writing in what appeared to be Sarah's personnel file. He didn't look up when she entered, a deliberate show of disrespect that made her jaw clench. Sarah stood at attention and waited. Morrison continued writing for another full minute, clearly enjoying the power play. Finally, he set down his pen and looked up with the same cold satisfaction he had worn the day before. "Martinez, I trust you've had time to think about our conversation yesterday and the changes that need to be made in your attitude." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied neutrally, not willing to give him any ammunition for further attacks. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with obvious displeasure. "I've been generous with you, Martinez. More generous than you deserve. Despite your insubordination and poor attitude, I'm not recommending your immediate discharge. Instead, you'll be transferred to supply duty, where hopefully you can learn some discipline while serving in a capacity more suited to your limitations." The assignment was clearly meant as a punishment and humiliation. Supply duty was typically reserved for soldiers who had proven incompetent in more demanding roles. It would effectively end any chance Sarah had of advancing in her career or taking on leadership responsibilities. "I understand, sir," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. Furthermore, Morrison continued, clearly enjoying himself, "You'll be reporting directly to me on a weekly basis to discuss your progress and attitude adjustment. I want regular written reports on your activities and your thoughts about your new role in this unit." It was harassment, pure and simple. Morrison was creating a system designed to make her life miserable until she either quit or gave him an excuse to have her discharged. The weekly reports were particularly insulting, a way to force her to grovel and demonstrate her supposed reformation. A knock on the office door interrupted Morrison's speech. He frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption to his systematic destruction of Sarah's career. "Come in," he called impatiently. Sergeant Williams stepped inside, his face showing unusual urgency. "Sir, sorry to interrupt, but we have visitors. General Patricia Hayes from the Pentagon is here with her staff for an unannounced inspection. She's requesting to meet with unit commanders immediately." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. General Hayes was a legend in the Army, the highest-ranking female officer in the service, and known for her fierce intelligence and no-nonsense approach to leadership. Her visits were rare and always significant. Morrison's face went pale. Unannounced inspections from the Pentagon were never good news, especially for commanders who might have questionable practices in their units. "How long until the meeting?" Morrison asked, his earlier confidence evaporating. "She's waiting in conference room right now, sir. She asked for all unit commanders and their staff to report immediately." Morrison stood up quickly, straightening his uniform and trying to regain his composure. "Martinez, we'll continue this conversation later. Williams, make sure all personnel are aware that we have VIP visitors and that everything better be spotless." As they left Morrison's office, Sarah couldn't help but feel a tiny spark of hope. General Hayes was known for her fairness and her commitment to rooting out problems in the ranks. Maybe, just maybe, this inspection would reveal Morrison's pattern of harassment and abuse. The conference room was buzzing with nervous energy when they arrived. General Hayes sat at the head of the long table, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room and its occupants. Her reputation preceded her. She was brilliant, tough, and absolutely intolerant of incompetence or corruption. Around the table sat Morrison and the other unit commanders, along with their senior staff. Sarah found herself near the back of the room, close enough to observe, but hopefully not conspicuous enough to draw attention. "Thank you all for gathering on short notice," General Hayes began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I'm here because we've received some concerning reports about training standards and personnel management at this facility." Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, though he tried to maintain an expression of confident professionalism. Sarah noticed that several other commanders also looked nervous, suggesting that the problems might extend beyond Morrison's unit. "Over the next 2 days, my team will be conducting comprehensive interviews with personnel at all levels," the general continued. "We'll be reviewing training records, personnel files, and conducting observations of daily operations. I want to be clear, this is not a routine inspection. We're here to investigate specific allegations of misconduct." The room fell completely silent. Sarah's pulse quickened as she realized this might be exactly the opportunity she had hoped for. If the general was investigating misconduct, Morrison's behavior toward her could finally be exposed and addressed. General Hayes scanned the room, her gaze sharp and assessing. "I've built my career on the principle that the Army succeeds when every soldier is given the opportunity to excel based on merit and dedication. Any officer who undermines that principle does a disservice to our entire institution." Her words seemed directed at the room in general, but Sarah noticed that the general's eyes lingered on Morrison for just a moment longer than the others. Could it be that the investigation was already focused on him specifically? "We'll begin with individual interviews this afternoon," General Hayes announced. "My staff will be contacting you to schedule appointments. I expect complete honesty and cooperation from everyone." Dismissed. As the meeting broke up, Sarah found herself walking behind Morrison and Sergeant Williams. She could see the tension in Morrison's shoulders and the way he kept clenching and unclenching his fists. For the first time in 3 years, Captain Morrison looked genuinely worried. "Williams," Morrison said quietly as they walked, "I want you to make sure that all personnel understand the importance of presenting a united front during these interviews. Remind them that unsupported complaints or gossip could damage the entire unit's reputation." Sarah felt her anger flare. Even now, faced with an official investigation, Morrison was trying to intimidate witnesses and cover up his behavior. But she also realized that his obvious fear meant he knew his actions couldn't withstand scrutiny. The rest of the morning passed in a strange atmosphere of nervous anticipation. Word had spread quickly about the investigation, and Soldiers throughout the base were speculating about what had triggered the Pentagon's attention. Some seemed worried about their own conduct being examined, while others appeared hopeful that long-standing problems might finally be addressed. Around noon, a young lieutenant from General Hayes' staff approached Sarah at the mess hall. "Lieutenant Martinez? The general would like to speak with you this afternoon at 1400 hours. Please report to conference room B." Sarah's stomach lurched with a mixture of excitement and terror. This was her chance to tell the truth about Morrison's treatment. But she also knew that speaking against a superior officer was dangerous. If the investigation didn't result in action against Morrison, her situation would become even worse. She spent the lunch hour trying to prepare for the interview, thinking through specific incidents and trying to organize her thoughts. She had decided that she would tell the complete truth, regardless of the consequences. Her military career was already effectively over thanks to Morrison's sabotage, so she had nothing left to lose. At exactly 1400 hours, Sarah knocked on the conference room door. General Hayes opened it herself, which surprised Sarah. She had expected to deal with staff members rather than the general directly. "Lieutenant Martinez, please come in and have a seat," General Hayes said warmly, gesturing to a chair across from her at the small conference table. The room was much smaller and more intimate than the morning's meeting space. General Hayes sat across from her with a legal pad and pen, but her manner was relaxed and encouraging rather than intimidating. "I want you to know, Lieutenant, that this conversation is confidential unless you specifically give me permission to use information you provide," the general began. "I'm here because we've received reports about potential problems with leadership and personnel management in several units at this base. I'm particularly interested in your experiences with Captain Morrison." Sarah's heart began to race. Someone had already reported Morrison, which meant she wasn't alone in her concerns about his behavior. The knowledge gave her courage to speak openly. "General Hayes, I want to be completely honest with you about my experiences, but I also want you to know that I've tried to handle these issues through normal channels without success," Sarah began carefully. "I appreciate your directness, Lieutenant. Please, tell me about your relationship with Captain Morrison and any concerns you might have about his leadership style." For the next hour, Sarah laid out the entire history of her interactions with Morrison. She described the constant criticism that went beyond normal military discipline, the impossible standards that seemed to apply only to her, and the pattern of harassment that had culminated in yesterday's public humiliation. General Hayes listened intently, taking notes, but never interrupting. Her expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see intelligence and concern in her eyes. When Sarah finished describing the previous day's confrontation, the general set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "Lieutenant Martinez, what you've described represents a serious pattern of discriminatory harassment and abuse of authority," General Hayes said firmly. "No soldier should be subjected to the treatment you've endured, regardless of their performance or background." Sarah felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. For 3 years, she had begun to doubt her own perceptions, wondering if maybe Morrison's criticism was justified, and she really was inadequate. Hearing a respected leader validate her experience was profoundly healing. "I have to ask you directly," the general continued. "Do you believe Captain Morrison's treatment of you was influenced by your gender, ethnicity, or other personal characteristics?" "Yes, ma'am, I do," Sarah replied without hesitation. His comments yesterday about diversity policies made that clear, but, honestly, I've suspected it from the beginning. I've watched him interact with other soldiers, and the standards he applies to me are completely different from what he expects from white male soldiers with similar or even lower performance levels. General Hayes nodded grimly. "I'm going to be frank with you, Lieutenant. You're not the first person to come forward with complaints about Captain Morrison. We've received multiple reports from different sources, all describing similar patterns of behavior. This investigation is specifically focused on his conduct and that of several other officers who appear to have created hostile environments for certain soldiers under their command." The revelation that others had also complained gave Sarah a sense of vindication mixed with sadness. She wasn't the only one who had suffered under Morrison's leadership, which meant other good soldiers had been damaged or driven away by his prejudice and abuse of power. "What happens now, General?" Sarah asked. "Now we complete our investigation by interviewing all relevant witnesses and reviewing documentation. Based on what I've heard so far, I expect we'll be taking significant action regarding Captain Morrison's continued service. As for you, Lieutenant Martinez, I want you to know that your career is far from over. General Hayes pulled out a different folder and opened it on the table. I've reviewed your complete service record, including performance evaluations from before Captain Morrison became your commanding officer. Your record shows consistent excellence in all areas of military service. The recent negative reports stand out as anomalies that don't match your demonstrated capabilities. Sarah stared at the folder, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Someone in authority had actually taken the time to look at the complete picture of her service rather than just accepting Morrison's biased evaluations. Furthermore, the general continued, I've spoken with several of your peers and subordinates during this investigation. The picture they paint of your leadership, competence, and character is completely at odds with Captain Morrison's assessments. It's clear to me that you've been the victim of a systematic campaign designed to destroy your career. The words hit Sarah like a physical force. After years of questioning herself and wondering if she really was as inadequate as Morrison claimed, hearing the truth spoken by someone of General Hayes' stature was overwhelming. I don't know what to say, General. I had almost convinced myself that maybe I really didn't belong in the Army. Lieutenant, let me be absolutely clear about something, General Hayes said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. The Army needs officers like you. Officers with integrity, dedication, and the courage to maintain their standards even under pressure. What happened to you here represents everything that's wrong with outdated attitudes that have no place in today's military. As the interview concluded, General Hayes stood and extended her hand to Sarah. Lieutenant Martinez, I want you to prepare yourself for some significant changes in your situation. This investigation will result in action, and I suspect you'll find your career taking a very different trajectory than what Captain Morrison had planned for you. Walking back to the barracks after the interview, Sarah felt lighter than she had in years. For the first time since arriving at the base, she had hoped that justice might actually prevail and that her military career might continue after all. The investigation continued for 2 more days, during which the atmosphere on the base grew increasingly tense. Sarah noticed that Captain Morrison looked increasingly haggard as more soldiers were called in for interviews with General Hayes' team. Word had spread quietly through the ranks that the investigation was serious and focused on specific leadership problems. On the 3rd morning, Sarah was approached by the same lieutenant from General Hayes' staff who had scheduled her initial interview. Lieutenant Martinez, the general requests your presence at 1,000 hours in the base commander's office. Please bring your personal gear and all documentation related to your service record. Sarah's heart began to race. Bringing personal gear suggested some kind of immediate change in her assignment, but she couldn't tell if that was good or bad news. The past few days had given her hope, but she had learned not to count on anything until it actually happened. When she arrived at the base commander's office, she found General Hayes waiting along with Colonel Thompson, the base commander, and another officer she didn't recognize, a tall woman with the eagles of a full colonel on her uniform. Lieutenant Martinez, please sit down, General Hayes said, gesturing to a chair facing the 3 senior officers. I want to update you on the results of our investigation and discuss your immediate future. Sarah sat down, trying to read the expressions of the officers facing her. General Hayes looked satisfied, Colonel Thompson appeared uncomfortable, and the unknown colonel seemed to be assessing Sarah with professional interest. First, let me address the investigation findings, General Hayes began. We have substantiated multiple violations of military equal opportunity policies, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer in Captain Morrison's treatment of you and several other soldiers under his command. Sarah felt a surge of vindication, though she tried to keep her expression neutral and professional. Captain Morrison has been immediately relieved of his command position and is facing formal charges that will likely result in his discharge from the Army. His actions violated not just military regulations, but the basic principles of leadership and respect that are fundamental to military service. The news that Morrison was actually facing serious consequences seemed almost too good to be true. Sarah had hoped for some form of justice, but she hadn't expected such swift and decisive action. However, General Hayes continued, the damage to your career and that of other affected soldiers cannot be undone simply by removing the source of the problem. The Army has a responsibility to make things right for the people who were wronged. She gestured to the unknown colonel. Lieutenant Martinez, I'd like you to meet Colonel Jennifer Walsh from the Pentagon's Personnel Development Division. She has a proposition for you. Colonel Walsh leaned forward, her manner direct but encouraging. Lieutenant Martinez, General Hayes has briefed me extensively on your situation and your service record. What happened to you here represents a failure of the system that's supposed to protect and develop our best officers. Sarah listened intently, still not sure where this conversation was heading. Based on your demonstrated performance prior to Captain Morrison's interference, and the recommendations of multiple colleagues who have worked with you, we're prepared to offer you an immediate promotion to captain and a transfer to a position that will fully utilize your capabilities. Sarah felt her mouth drop open in shock. She had expected maybe a clean slate and a chance to rebuild her career, but an immediate promotion was beyond anything she had imagined. The position we're offering, Colonel Walsh continued, is as a training officer at the Army's Leadership Development Center at Fort Belvoir. You would be responsible for developing and implementing new programs to prevent the kind of discrimination and harassment you experienced, while also training the next generation of military leaders. General Hayes added, Lieutenant Martinez, your experience, while traumatic, has given you unique insights into both the problems facing our institution and the resilience required to overcome them. We believe you can help ensure that other soldiers don't face what you've been through. Sarah struggled to find words. The offer was not just vindication, but an opportunity to turn her painful experience into something positive that could help other soldiers. It was more than she had dared to hope for. I'm honored by your confidence in me, Sarah finally managed to say. But I have to ask, why such a significant opportunity? I mean, I appreciate the promotion and the chance to start over, but this seems like much more than just correcting an injustice. Colonel Walsh smiled, the first warm expression Sarah had seen from her. Lieutenant Martinez, we've done extensive research into your background and capabilities. Your performance records before coming here were exceptional. Your leadership during training exercises has been noted by multiple superior officers, and your ability to maintain your integrity and professionalism despite 3 years of harassment demonstrates exactly the kind of character we need in our senior leadership. General Hayes nodded in agreement. The Army is changing, Lieutenant Martinez. We're working to eliminate the old boys club mentality that allowed officers like Morrison to flourish. But change requires leaders who understand both the problems and the solutions. Your experience makes you uniquely qualified to help lead that transformation. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she fought them back. These were tears of relief and gratitude, but she wanted to maintain her composure in front of these senior officers who were offering her such an incredible opportunity. There's one more thing, General Hayes said, producing an official-looking document. The Army is also issuing a formal apology for the treatment you received here. Captain Morrison's actions violated our policies and our values, and you deserve recognition that what happened to you was wrong. The formal apology was important to Sarah in ways that went beyond career advancement. It was official acknowledgement that she hadn't been oversensitive or inadequate, but had been the victim of systematic discrimination. After years of being made to feel like she was the problem, having the Army officially state otherwise was deeply meaningful. I accept your offer, Sarah said firmly. And I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to make sure other soldiers don't go through what I experienced. Colonel Walsh stood and extended her hand. Welcome to your new assignment, Captain Martinez. Your promotion is effective immediately, and you'll report to Fort Belvoir next Monday to begin your new role. As Sarah shook hands with the 3 officers, she felt a sense of completion and new beginnings simultaneously. The nightmare of the past 3 years was finally over, but more than that, she was being given the chance to turn that experience into something positive and meaningful. After the meeting concluded, Sarah walked back across the base one last time as a lieutenant stationed at this desert training facility. Tomorrow she would leave for Fort Belvoir as a newly promoted captain with an important mission. The contrast between her situation now and just a week ago was almost overwhelming. As she packed her belongings that evening, Sarah reflected on the events that had transformed her life. The public humiliation that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the catalyst for justice and opportunity. If Morrison hadn't gone too far in his harassment, if the investigation hadn't happened, she might have spent years trapped in a cycle of discrimination and blocked advancement. Her roommate, Lieutenant Amy Chan, helped her pack while peppering her with questions about her new assignment. Word had spread quickly through the base about Morrison's removal and Sarah's promotion, creating a buzz of conversation about the dramatic changes. "I can't believe Morrison is actually being discharged," Amy said as she helped fold Sarah's uniforms. "I mean, everyone knew he was unfair to you, but nobody thought anything would ever be done about it." Sarah paused in her packing, considering Amy's words. "You know what bothers me most about this whole situation? It's not just that Morrison was a bad leader. It's that everyone knew he was treating people unfairly, but the system didn't address it until someone from outside came in." Amy nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's part of what you'll be able to change in your new job. Make it so soldiers don't have to wait for a general to show up before problems get fixed." The observation was insightful and reinforced Sarah's commitment to her new role. She had experienced firsthand how isolation and helplessness felt when facing discrimination from a superior officer. If she could help create systems that protected other soldiers from similar experiences, her own ordeal would have served a greater purpose. The next morning, Sarah attended one final formation with her unit. Colonel Thompson, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but trying to project leadership, addressed the assembled soldiers about the command changes and the importance of maintaining unit cohesion during transitions. As the formation ended, several of her fellow soldiers approached Sarah to congratulate her on her promotion and express their admiration for her perseverance. Many admitted that they had witnessed Morrison's unfair treatment, but hadn't known how to help or hadn't been willing to risk their own careers by speaking up. Sergeant Williams, who had always been professional but distant during Morrison's tenure, pulled Sarah aside after the others had left. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," he said, his expression serious and regretful. "I knew what Morrison was doing to you was wrong, but I didn't have the courage to speak up. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere between officers, but that was just an excuse for my own cowardice." Sarah appreciated his honesty, though she also understood the difficult position he had been in. "Sergeant Williams, I don't blame you or anyone else for not speaking up. Morrison created an environment where supporting me would have meant risking your own career. The system failed all of us by allowing him to operate that way." Williams shook his head. "Maybe so, but watching a good officer get destroyed because I was too worried about my own skin doesn't sit right with me. I hope your new assignment gives you the chance to make sure other sergeants don't make the same mistake I did." His words reinforced Sarah's understanding that her new role wasn't just about preventing harassment from above, but also about creating a culture where good soldiers at all levels felt empowered and obligated to stand up for what was right. As she drove away from the base for the last time, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief at escaping Morrison's harassment, excitement about her new opportunities, but also a soberness about the broader problems her experience had revealed. The Army had given her justice and opportunity, but she knew that her case was probably unusual in getting such high-level attention and decisive action. How many other soldiers were currently suffering under commanders like Morrison without anyone noticing or caring enough to intervene? Her new assignment would give her the platform and authority to work on these systemic issues, but she knew the challenge would be enormous. Changing institutional culture was far more difficult than dealing with individual bad actors like Morrison. 3 weeks later, Captain Sarah Martinez stood in front of her first class at the Army Leadership Development Center. The room was filled with lieutenant colonels and majors who would soon take command of their own units. These were the officers who would shape the experiences of thousands of soldiers under their command. "Today we're going to talk about leadership failures," Sarah began, her voice confident and clear. "Not the dramatic kind that make headlines, but the everyday failures that destroy careers and damage the institution we've sworn to serve." As she looked out at the attentive faces in her audience, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The humiliation and pain of Morrison's harassment had been transformed into purpose and opportunity. She was no longer just surviving in the Army. She was actively working to make it better for everyone who came after her. The general had indeed walked in and changed everything, but Sarah understood that the real change would come from the work she was now doing to ensure that future soldiers wouldn't need a general to rescue them from discrimination and abuse. The system itself had to be better, and she was now in a position to help make that happen. Captain Martinez began her presentation, ready to train a new generation of leaders who would understand that true military strength came from developing every soldier's potential, regardless of their background or identity. Morrison's attempt to destroy her career had ultimately led to her being positioned to prevent other Morrisons from harming the soldiers under their command. Justice had been served, but, more importantly, the future was being changed.